What's good, fellas? Cheap Bastard talking to ya. For today, I have prepared you an interesting vid. We will test if gaming with 4 gigs of RAM is still possible in 2019. You know, once 4 gigs was the maximum amount of memory that PCs or operating systems could support. Even today, 32-bit Windows 10 won't support more than 4 gigabytes of RAM. So, let's test some games. To compare the results, I also tested the same games with the same settings using 16 gigs of RAM. My testing system contains Intel Xeon E3-1240 V2 CPU, MSI Armor GTX 1060 6GB, and single ADATA 1600 MHz DDR3 stick with 4 gigs of memory. And for 16GB test, I used 2 sticks of Kingston 1600 MHz DDR3 with 8GB of memory each. The first game I've tested is Need for Speed Payback. With 4GB of RAM, we got an average of 68, a minimum of 4.5 and a maximum of 91.7 FPS. And with 16GB of RAM, we got an average of 74.3, a minimum of 56.9 and the maximum of 102 FPS. While playing the game with 4GB of RAM, I noticed that when there's too much action going on, the game lags, and that happens pretty often. So if you're going to play with 4GB of RAM, expect some lag. Moving on to the next game, Overwatch. With 16 gigs of RAM, we got an average of 163 FPS, a minimum of 71.5 and the maximum of 195.7 FPS. With 4GB of RAM, we managed to get an average of 121 FPS, a minimum of 70.8 and the maximum of 168 FPS. Playing with 4GB of RAM felt the same as playing with 16 gigs. Gaming performance was always flawless. Next up, we got Fortnite. Last video we asked you guys if you should change Fortnite into any other game, but you left no comments regarding Fortnite question, so we are still testing it. With 4GB of RAM, we got an average of 88.4 FPS, a minimum of 12.9 and the maximum of 124.9 FPS. With 16 gigs of RAM, we got an average of 89.1 FPS, a minimum of 50 and the maximum of 152 FPS. Again, I didn't notice any difference between 4 and 16 gigs of RAM. Moving on, we got Tomb Raider. With 4GB of RAM, we got an average of 128 FPS, a minimum of 90.3 and the maximum of 161.2 FPS. And with 16 gigs of RAM, we got an average of 166 FPS, a minimum of 70.6 and the maximum of 230 FPS. Yet again, I felt no difference between 4 and 16 gigabytes. The next game I've tested is GTA 5. Playing with 16 gigs of RAM was normal and everything was fine, but when I played with 4 gigs, I noticed that when you're driving really fast, some cars would appear out of nowhere. But it happens pretty rarely, so it's not a big deal. Now let's check out our benchmarks. And with 4 gigs of RAM, we got an average of 61.4 FPS, a minimum of 46.2 and the maximum of 202 FPS. And with 16 gigabytes of RAM, we got an average of 70.5, a minimum of 58.9 and the maximum of 230 FPS. And finally, the last game I've tested is CSGO. With 16 gigabytes of RAM, we got an average of 171 FPS, a minimum of 42.7 and the maximum of 290 FPS. With 4 gigabytes of RAM, we got an average of 139.5 FPS, a minimum of 61.5 and the maximum of 288.5 FPS. While playing with 16 gigabytes of RAM, nothing really interesting happened. It was just normal, standard gameplay. But when playing with 4 gigabytes of RAM, a lot of textures didn't load and the whole map was basically... In conclusion, playing with 4 gigabytes of RAM is not that bad. at least for most of the games, and I was really surprised how well it performed. But for some demanding games it's going to lag a bit, and that's pretty annoying. Thank you for watching this video. If you liked it, smash that like button. And subscribe for more videos like this. See you next time. Cheap Bastard out.